Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping physicians in Michigan turn their professional success into financial success while enjoying life along the way. And now, here are your hosts, Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness. This is Trent DeBruin, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Mushbaugh. And before we dive into today's episode, we wanted to take a minute to share something based on some of the questions we've been receiving.
Are we officially calling Michigan a national championship contender?
Well, maybe not quite yet, but we're getting closer.
All right, I'll take it. It wasn't an outright no.
Well, glad I didn't disappoint there. So no, as of now, there are no claims for Michigan being a national championship contender, but we've received a number of one-off questions, which we always enjoy answering, and we wanted to give a little background for those who may want more help above and beyond those one-off questions. So as you may or may not know from listening to the show, in addition to hosting this podcast, Andrew and I are also the co-founders of MD Wealth Management, which is a financial planning and investment firm that specializes in working with physicians. And while we're planning to limit the total number of people we work with long-term to around 100, as of now, we are still taking on new clients. So if you're considering hiring a financial advisor or are looking for some additional help, we're always happy to have a 15-minute introductory call to learn more about you and what you're looking for help with, and also to share a little bit about our firm and how we work with our clients. So if you're interested in scheduling a call, the easiest way to do it is by visiting our website, mdwmllc.com, and clicking on the Becoming a Client tab. There you'll see an overview of our process and a link where you can schedule a 15-minute intro call. And even if we find out that it's not a great mutual fit after our call, we'll still happily answer any questions you have and point you in the right direction of another advisor or resource that's better suited to your needs and what you're looking for help with. All right, now on to today's show. And today what we're going to be talking about is saving to your employer retirement plan. And specifically, one of the key questions or decisions you have to make when doing this, which is whether to make Roth contributions or pre-tax contributions, which are also known as traditional contributions, to your accounts. And while it's simple to check one of the two boxes when you set up your retirement contributions, the implications of your choice can be pretty significant in terms of the amount of taxes you'll ultimately pay throughout your lifetime, as well as what it means for you and your family or heirs down the road, both in retirement and beyond. So we want to spend some time breaking it down and sharing some perspective to help you better understand it. So Andrew, why don't you walk through an initial overview of the differences between Roth and traditional contributions?
Sure. So before deciding which type of contribution is right for you, the first step is simply understanding the differences between Roth and traditional contributions. From there, you'll be able to better understand the implications of the Roth versus traditional decision and what's best given your situation. At a basic level, deciding between Roth versus traditional contributions comes down to the timing of when you'd like to pay taxes, since there's no way to completely avoid paying taxes outside of having an HSA account and using it to pay for healthcare costs. So knowing the differences based on the timing of when you pay taxes, the decision is A, do I want to pay taxes today at my current tax rate? Or B, pay taxes in the future when I withdraw the money. A Roth contribution is money that you pay taxes on today, aka there's no immediate tax benefit for your contribution, in exchange for tax-free growth and tax-free distributions in the future. Whereas a traditional contribution is money that you contribute in exchange for a tax deduction today and tax-free growth, then you pay taxes on the money when you withdraw it in the future. Or think about it in non-financial terms, you can look at the difference between Roth and traditional contributions, like a farmer planting seeds and eventually having a harvest from those seeds. Do you want to pay taxes on the seeds or the harvest? A Roth contribution would be like the farmer paying taxes today on the seeds in exchange for the tax-free benefit of the future harvest, whereas traditional contributions would be avoiding taxes today on the seeds in exchange for paying taxes on the harvest down the road. So that's looking at the difference between Roth versus traditional contributions from a bigger picture, but there are several different accounts where you'll have the option of Roth versus traditional contributions. The three main accounts are, number one, an IRA or individual retirement account, number two, a 401k or 403b if you work for a non-for-profit employer, and number three, a 457b plan. Starting with the first tax advantage account, you can contribute to an individual retirement account, or IRA, as long as you or your spouse have earned income. And as a side note, your eligibility for making IRA contributions has nothing to do with your employer retirement plans. However, there are certain stipulations based on your income where you may or may not be eligible to make traditional or Roth IRA contributions and receive the same tax benefits. We've discussed this in more detail in prior episodes, so we won't go into more details here, but the main takeaway with IRAs is that it's another potential account to save to in a tax-advantaged way by making Roth or traditional contributions, and you want to understand how your unique situation impacts your ability to make these contributions. The second and third tax advantage accounts, where you'll have to make that Roth versus traditional contribution decision, are relevant if you're an employed physician. This will be different for each person based on the benefits offered through their employer, but you'll have access to certain retirement savings accounts through your employer, like a 401k, 403b, or 457b. Looking at your employer retirement plans, there are two different ways that money gets into these accounts. One of them is through employee contributions, or the money you contribute, which is deducted automatically from your paycheck. The other way is through employer contributions, which is money your employer contributes to your account as an employer match or profit-sharing contribution. So you can think of this employer match as additional compensation on top of your salary and bonus. Unlike your employee contributions, where you can decide between Roth or traditional contributions, you're not able to choose how your employer contributions are made. And to keep from overcomplicating things, you can essentially view the matching employer contributions in your traditional bucket. However, you don't get a tax deduction for the contributions they make on your behalf. So it's free money to you, but you'll eventually have to pay taxes when you withdraw it in the future. And as you can see, deciding whether to make Roth or traditional contributions is about comparing when you want to pay taxes, which unfortunately there isn't an option of never. So Trent, why don't you talk about how to think through the Roth versus traditional decision and what's best given each person's unique situation?
Sure. So knowing that this comes down to choosing whether you want to pay taxes on the money now or later, at the most basic level, it's a matter of comparing your tax rate when you contribute the money to what your tax rate will be when you withdraw it. Tax rates are based on your income, so if you think about the progression for the typical physician throughout their life, there are really three unique phases. The first is the early years when you're in training and earning that resident or fellow income. These are the years when your income and tax rate are the lowest. The second phase is the years spent working as an attending. When you move to this phase, there's a jump in income and therefore tax rate. Depending on your specialty and your work situation, your income can continue to grow throughout these many years spent working as an attending, but it's safe to say that these years as a whole are the ones where your income and tax rate tend to be the highest during your lifetime. The final phase, phase 3, is when you retire. When this happens, you transition from living on your paycheck from your employer to living on a paycheck generated from your income sources like Social Security and withdrawing from your various investment accounts. For the majority of physicians, there's a drop in your income and tax rate in retirement, although hopefully it settles at a higher level than in training. With that in mind, looking at the situation for the typical attending, you know your tax rate during your working years, i.e. when you're contributing to your employer retirement accounts, is most likely higher than it'll be in retirement, and therefore tax deductions now are worth more than what they'd be worth in the future in retirement. Because of that, it's typically most financially optimal to make pre-tax contributions to your retirement plans. You contribute money now, receive a tax deduction for it at a relatively higher tax rate, then withdraw the money in retirement and pay taxes on it at a relatively lower tax rate because your income and tax rate have declined at that point. And just to provide some context here, let's say you're a typical physician in the 32% marginal tax bracket. However, you know that in retirement, your income will drop to a level that will only put you in the 22% marginal tax bracket. If that's the case, you know that if you contribute $1 to your retirement accounts on a pre-tax basis today, you'll save 32 cents in taxes. Then when you withdraw that $1 in retirement, you'll only pay 22 cents in taxes on it. So you'll save that difference in the two tax rates, or 10 cents for every dollar, and that's additional money in your pocket that will avoid going to the IRS. And while this 10% difference in tax rates and tax savings may or may not sound like a lot, when you think about your entire working career where you're contributing hundreds of thousands of dollars to these accounts that could end up being worth several $1 million down the road, you can see how significant it becomes. So that's the situation for the typical attending physician. However, we do want to take a minute to briefly touch on that earlier period during training. As mentioned, this is the time where your income and tax rate are likely the lowest they'll ever be in your lifetime, and even lower than they'll be in retirement. With that in mind, and following the same logic we just outlined, with a lower tax rate now, tax deductions are worth less to you today. So in this situation, it likely makes the most sense for you to make Roth contributions instead of pre-tax. You won't receive a tax deduction today, but you know that once the money is in the account, it'll grow tax-free, and you won't have to pay taxes in the future when you withdraw the money in retirement, at which point your tax rate will likely be higher than it is today. And just as an aside, one thing we do want to mention for compliance purposes is that none of this overall discussion represents tax advice. So what we're talking about here is a framework for the typical physician situation, but we know that everyone is unique and you may or may not fit into the typical mold. So we always recommend consulting with your CPA or tax professional before making any decisions here. So that covers the common situation and a general rule of thumb of what makes sense for the Roth versus pre-tax decision for the typical employed physician in isolation. But as we know, nothing stays the same, and especially when it comes to legislation and tax law changes.
Yeah, and we're going through this right now with some of the proposed legislation where there are a handful of major tax changes that add additional facets to this decision. So the first thing we want to point out is that tax rates can and do change over time, which makes this calculation less straightforward of saying today I'm paying taxes at, say, 32%. In the future, if tax rates are the exact same, I'll pay taxes at 22%. And tax rates are dependent on what Congress decides, which in turn is dependent on the political and economic environment of that period. For example, if you look at how tax rates have evolved over time in the US, the highest marginal tax rate was only 7% in the early 1900s, but it then rose to 94% around World War II, fell back to 28% during the 1980s, and has since risen and is currently at 37%. So we know today's tax rates are unlikely to remain the same into the future, but at the same time, it's impossible to predict exactly how they'll change and when they'll change. So we're left trying to make our best decision based on the information we have today, which really is financial planning in a nutshell, a series of educated decisions based on what we know today, and then adjusting as life and other factors change. And bringing this back to the Roth versus pre-tax decision, if you decide to make pre-tax contributions today based on a 32% tax bracket, and assuming your tax bracket will be 22% retirement, but then in the future, tax rates rise dramatically, and that retirement tax bracket ends up being more than 32%, you'd be kicking yourself and wishing you had made Roth contributions instead, knowing that you would have been able to avoid paying that higher tax rate down the road in retirement. That being said, it could also work in reverse, where you decided to make Roth contributions on the front end, anticipating a higher tax rate environment, but tax rates then fall, and it turns out you would have been better making pre-tax contributions and receiving the tax deduction for them on the front end while you were working. There's no silver bullet here due to the uncertainty and unpredictability involved, so there are some situations where there's more of a gray area, and then others, like being in training, where it's more clear-cut of what would be the optimal decision from a tax perspective. So tax rate uncertainty is just one factor that could change the decision-making process, but another factor is looking out beyond just your lifetime and leaving behind a legacy.
Yeah, and the first one we want to talk about is passing on money to your heirs. When it comes to leaving a legacy, there's no right or wrong answer here, and it really just comes down to personal preference. For some people, passing along an inheritance to their kids or others, heirs, is important, while for others, it's just not as important.
Yeah, and to our son Grant, if you're listening to this and thinking about things down the road, don't plan on quitting your day job.
Well, if Grant's listening, I have to think that at 13 months old, he's our youngest podcast listener.
Yeah, it's probably a safe bet.
I think he has a future as a financial planner.
Hope so.
So we know you don't want Grant relying on an inheritance, which I know we're joking, but like I said, there really is no right or wrong answer here. Some people take the view that they'd like to be able to see their heirs use the money while they're still alive to see it, while others want to wait and have it used to jumpstart education savings for future generations, or potentially not leave any money to their direct heirs and instead give it to a charity or to a family foundation. With that being said, if you're someone who's interested in passing along money to your heirs, this is a relevant factor in the Roth versus pre-tax decision. The reason why is that retirement accounts, along with homes and real estate, tend to be the largest source of money being passed along as part of an inheritance. And the form these accounts usually take is an IRA, or an individual retirement account. The way it works is that when you retire from your job, you typically roll your employer retirement plan money, whether it's a 401k, 403b, etc., into an IRA. You then withdraw money from this account during retirement to help fund your lifestyle, and when you eventually pass away, if there's any money left in your IRA account, it goes to whoever you have listed as your beneficiary, whether that's an individual or a trust, which in turn then determines where the money goes and who gets what. From the standpoint of the beneficiary, when you inherit an IRA account, you have to pay any taxes that are due as you withdraw the money. If it's a pre-tax IRA that you inherit, you'll owe taxes on each dollar you withdraw. Whereas if it's a Roth IRA, you won't owe taxes on any of the money that you withdraw. Now, under previous tax law, non-spouse beneficiaries who inherited an IRA, most commonly children of the person who passed away, had the ability to spread out their withdrawals over longer periods of time based on their own life expectancy, thereby easing the tax burden over many years if it was a pre-tax IRA where they had to pay taxes on each dollar that was withdrawn. However, the Secure Act, which was passed a couple years ago, made changes to the way inherited IRAs are treated, so that now, for the vast majority of beneficiaries, you have to withdraw the full amount within 10 years of inheriting an IRA. This may not seem like a huge deal on the face of it, but think about a situation where someone's inheriting a $2 million IRA. Even if they space their withdrawals out evenly, that would be an additional $200,000 of income they'd have to report for taxes each year, which would likely mean also pushing them up into a higher tax bracket and having them pay taxes on that extra income at an even higher rate. So depending on the size of the IRA and the person's tax situation, this could be pretty significant. Now, going back to the Roth versus pre-tax decision for employer retirement plan contributions, if you know you'd like to leave an inheritance to your kids or some other beneficiary down the road, you might want to take these tax considerations into account when contributing to your employer retirement accounts. Knowing that if you make pre-tax contributions now, your heirs will eventually have to pay taxes on the money down the road, you might choose to instead make Roth contributions now, so that your heirs won't owe any taxes on that money later. It's essentially a situation of deciding whether you want the tax burden to be on you or on your heirs. And if you are someone who's focused on legacy and you know you'll have more than enough money for yourself in your own retirement, you might choose to do your heirs a favor by paying the tax bill rather than having them pay it. If you do decide to do this, it can put your heirs in a great situation when it comes to inheriting the money down the road. They'll not only inherit the money when you pass, but it'll be in the form of a Roth IRA, so that they can let it continue to grow tax-free until they're required to withdraw it. And then when they do withdraw the money, they won't have to pay any taxes on it. In other words, this would be essentially doing your heirs a favor and passing along money to them in a way that's extremely tax efficient from their perspective. So as you can see, the first consideration when thinking about the Roth versus pre-tax decision is looking at your own tax situation. But the next level is thinking about the tax situation for whoever might eventually inherit the account. And if you're someone who's focused on leaving a legacy and would like to make things even more tax efficient for your heirs, you might choose to quote unquote pay the tax bill for your future heirs by making Roth contributions now, or by taking advantage of proactive tax planning like Roth conversions, which we discussed in a previous episode on tax planning in retirement.
Yeah, and one other situation we want to cover that could impact the Roth versus pre-tax decision, which isn't as common as the one we just covered, is one where there's not likely to be much of a difference in your tax rate between your working years and retirement. As we mentioned earlier, for the vast majority of people, your income and therefore your tax rate fall in retirement when you're no longer working and receiving a paycheck. However, we know that there are those rare situations where someone's tax rate doesn't actually fall during retirement. And at the most basic level, it would be because you have significant income from one source or another in retirement. There are different factors that could drive this, but it's often because you or your spouse have particularly large pre-tax IRA balances, along with working later in your career. While this could change again in the future with the new tax legislation, there are required distributions from your traditional IRA or pre-tax accounts, aka the government wants you to pay taxes, and these required distributions are called your required minimum distributions, and they are the amount of money you have to withdraw each year starting at age 72. So in the scenario of a large combination of IRA balances and a delayed retirement, you may be surprised by how large of an amount your required minimum distributions are, which could result in you being in a higher tax bracket than your working years. It could also be a situation where you have an ownership in a business or some type of passive income investment that kicks off a large amount of profits or income to you each year, and then you have to pay taxes on that money. Now, it's worth noting that the IRA balances would have to be pretty large, or the additional taxable income from the business or real estate ownership would have to be pretty high to keep your tax rate at a similar level as it was before you retired. But it does happen occasionally, so we at least wanted to mention that there are certain situations where Roth contributions can still make sense, even if in a high tax bracket today. And the connection to the Roth versus pre-tax decision is that if you happen to be one of those people where your tax rate in retirement is going to be similar to what it was while you were working, then it's less obvious whether you should choose to make Roth or pre-tax contributions. If there's no difference in the tax rate when you contribute the money compared to when you withdraw it, then there's no tax rate arbitrage that you can take advantage of by choosing one type of contributions over the other. So in theory, at least from a financial and tax perspective, you would be agnostic to which one you choose.
We're both hoping we have big enough IRA balances down the road that that's a factor, right?
Oh, exactly. Or at least let's hope so, especially since we never want to retire.
So that covers everything we wanted to touch on with our discussion of the Roth versus pre-tax decision. We know this distinction isn't always explained that well when you receive your employee benefits and retirement savings plan options. So hopefully this puts some context and framework to it and helps you better understand some of the things to consider when making that decision. And just to give a quick recap of what we covered, number one, most employer retirement plans and also IRAs give you the option to make either Roth or pre-tax or traditional contributions. For Roth contributions, you don't receive a tax deduction today, but once the money's in the account, it grows tax-free and you never have to pay taxes on it again. Whereas for traditional or pre-tax contributions, you receive a tax deduction today. Once the money's in the account, it grows tax-deferred, and when you eventually withdraw it in retirement, you pay taxes on each dollar you withdraw. Number two, knowing the difference in tax treatment for the two types of contributions, the most important factor is what your tax rate is today when you contribute the money compared to what it'll be in retirement when you withdraw the money. For most physicians, your tax rate will be higher during your working years than it'll be in retirement, so pre-tax contributions make the most sense because you're able to receive a tax deduction now when your tax rate is higher, then withdraw the money in retirement and pay taxes on it when your tax rate is lower. Number three, this framework is based on the assumption that tax rates will remain stable over time, whereas we recognize they can and do change depending on Congress and legislation. So changes in tax rates will have an impact, but they're also impossible to predict. And lastly, number four, there are certain exceptions or unique situations when it comes to this decision. One of them is if you're planning to leave a legacy and you want to do your heirs a favor by paying the taxes on the money now by making Roth contributions so they don't owe any taxes down the road. And another one is if you're one of the rare people whose tax rate in retirement will be similar to their tax rate while working. If that's the case, it's less obvious which type of contributions are more financially optimal for you. Well, thank you as always for joining us for another episode of the show. If you have thoughts to share or questions you'd like to have answered on a future mailbag episode, you're always welcome to email us at info@mdwmllc.com. You can also find the show notes and links for this episode on our website at mdwmllc.com/podcast. Take care, everyone, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Want even more ideas, tools, and resources on how to make smart financial decisions? check out the resources section of MD Wealth Management's website at mdwmllc.com, where you'll find additional knowledge and insight from Michigan physicians, including a blog, ebook, and one-page guides. While there, you can also schedule a 15-minute conversation with Andrew and Trent to learn more about what it means to work with the firm and how they serve physicians. If you've enjoyed the content, please leave a review on iTunes and share with your friends and colleagues. Thanks so much for listening. Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin are certified financial planners, principals, and co-founders of MD Wealth Management, a registered investment advisory firm in the state of Michigan. All opinions shared in the show are for general information and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future returns. Please consult with your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before making any decisions.